So we are fetching our data, but as I mentioned at the end of the last lecture, we are of course not showing any loading or error state at the moment. And that's not necessarily the behavior we want. Instead, we might want to only load this list of meals here once we really get a list of meals. And to achieve this, we need to manage more state. And now, since we will have related state, we could also consider using useReducer for that. But I'll stick to 3 individual use state pieces. I will add a isLoading state and a setIsLoading state updating function. And initially it's false. Initially we're not loading. But in useEffect, at the beginning of this fetchMeals function, I want to call setIsLoading and set this to true, because now we clearly are loading. Of course, since we know that right when this component will be rendered, we will be loading, we could also consider not setting isLoading to true here, but instead setting the initial state to true. Because we know that we always will start with loading data in this component when the component is rendered. And therefore, in this case, that's fine. Of course, if you have a component where that's not necessarily the case, where you're not necessarily loading just because the component was created for the first time, there you might not want to set this. But here it should be fine. Now we want to set isLoading to false once we're done. So in the end, once we also set the meals, we want to set isLoading to false, because we now definitely are done loading. And now we can use setIsLoading to control what we render. And we could say that we don't want to render our meals at all. So this entire section should not be rendered at all if we're loading. So for that, we can simply check if isLoading is true. And I check this before I try to map my meals. Before I do any of that, I check if isLoading is true. And if it is true, I will return something else in this functional component. So then we don't even make it to the code down there. And I'll return a section here where I simply have a paragraph where I say loading. Like this. If we add that code, you will see there is this loading text on the left, briefly showing up when we reload this. And that's, of course, not the best way to show it. And therefore, let's style it by adding a class name here of classes meals loading, written like this maybe. And then we can dive into this available meals module CSS file and add this quickly, add a class selector for the meals loading class, where we set text align to center and set the color to white. Of course, you can definitely give this a more elaborate styling, but it's better than nothing. Because with this class added here and assigned here to this section, with those changes made, if I reload, we at least have the loading text here. And it's still only flashing for a brief moment because Firebase is a quick backend, but it's better than nothing. Of course, here we could consider omitting this loading state since the data is loading rather quickly. But of course we don't know which internet connection our end users might have, so showing this loading state might not be too bad. Actually, there it was showing up a bit longer. So that is not too bad. But what if we have an error? We should also work on that. Let's simulate an error. And for that we can, for example, remove .json. Something Firebase doesn't like, and if we do it and I reload, we therefore fail to load the data. We don't see anything here in our app, but we see it if I open the developer tools. There we see that we have an error. We failed to fetch the data. And of course, our typical users will not check that console. Therefore, we want to show the error also here on this screen. And it's up to you how you want to show it. I at least want to show an error message down here instead of loading. Hence, we need a third state. We need a state that determines whether we have an error or not. So an HTTP error, for example, but the state name is up to you. So here we have that. And initially, the value here is false or maybe null or simply undefined. Because it's not just a true false value, later instead I want to have the error message here, and initially I don't want to have any value. So an undefined value, so not passing any default value like this should be fine. We could also set it to null to be more explicit about our goal of not having any value initially. But I'll go with undefined. Now when we fetch data and we fail, I want to, well, set my error. For this, we first of all need to find out if we failed. Now for this, I want to check if response OK is falsy. So if it's not OK, hence the exclamation mark. And we'll make it into this if check if we have some error status code reported back by the server. And if that should be the case, I want to throw a new error here where I say something went wrong. Now we could also look into the error response and see if the server gave us a more useful error string, but here I'll just stick to this generic error message. And I'm throwing it as a new error, which means that the lines thereafter won't execute. Instead, now we want to handle this error, and that's another advantage of using a separate function for wrapping this fetch logic. This fetchMeals function will now throw an error if something goes wrong with sending that request. Therefore, we can go to the place where we call fetchMeals, which is still inside of useEffect, but outside of the fetchMeals function, of course. And we can simply wrap this with try catch. So we can try and catch here. So we try calling fetchMeals, but if inside of that function an error is thrown, as is the case here, then we make it into this catch block, which is still inside of the effect function, but outside of the fetchMeals function. And then here we can do whatever we want to do. I want to set is loading to false because we're not loading anymore. Even if it's an error, we're done loading. And I want to set HTTP error to the error we caught. So we do get access to that error here when using try catch, and therefore I can set the HTTP error to the error we're getting, or to be precise, to the error message. We'll get an error object here, and that object by default has a message property. When we generate an error like this, and we pass a string to the constructor, that string will be stored in the message property of the created error object. And with that, we should be setting this error state. Now we can also utilize that, and we can check, maybe after we checked for whether we're loading, we can check if HTTP error is truthy. So if it has a string with some text inside of it, for example. And in that case, return yet another state. In that case, I want to return a section with a text of HTTP error. So where I output my error text. And I'll give this a class of meals error, which we have yet to add. And we can quickly add this together, meals error. Here, I'll also set this to text align center, but set the color to red. And that will not be too beautiful. I just want to have this little bit more errorish style. You can, of course, fine-tune the styling exactly as you want it. So now with that, if we save this and I reload here, we'll notice something interesting. It still only says loading here. Now, that can be tricky to spot. The reason for that is that we're using try catch, but keep in mind that fetchMeals is an async function. And therefore, it always returns a promise. Now, if we throw an error inside of a promise, that error will cause that promise to reject. So we can't use try catch to wrap it unless we also await this, for which we would need to turn our effect function here into an async function, which we're not allowed to do. Now we could still work around that by putting that into a separate function, which we call thereafter, so that we have two separate functions, one for sending the HTTP request and one for error handling. And that would be absolutely fine. But here I think it's a bit easier to simply use the fact that it's a promise and add the catch method on it. Since that returns a promise, we can add then to handle success cases when the promise fulfills successfully, and we can add catch to handle errors coming up inside of the promise. And therefore, instead of try catch here, we want to catch the error we're getting and move that code here into this catch block. And that's the traditional promise-only way of handling an error inside of a promise. And I hope I could make it clear why we need this here. With that, if we save this, if I reload, we see loading briefly and then failed to fetch. And again, of course, we can definitely improve the error handling here. We can show a more useful error message, but here my focus is to show you how it generally works. Because what you now render on the screen, that's of course not related to HTTP requests or anything like that. Here you can now build any user interface you want. But that therefore is how we could also handle errors. And with that, I'll re-add .json here to get rid of that error. And once we do that and we reload, we of course do load the data successfully again. And therefore, with that, we now implemented this third feature here, fetching meals data. Now let's work on a checkout and order form so that we can fetch some user data, which we then, as a last step, also submit to the server as an order. So now we added a couple of items to our cart. It would now be nice if we could order them. For this we have the order button, but currently that's not doing anything. I want to make sure that when we click this order button, we kind of expand this modal, and we also show a form where the user should enter the address and the name, and thereafter we can confirm that input to send off that order to the backend. And therefore the first step is to add that form and to add validation to that form. For this, let's go back to the code, and there into the cart folder where we have this cart component which renders this modal with our cart data, with the total and with those buttons. And here below the total, above those buttons, I now want to render the form where we enter our data. And for that, I'll add a new component and I'll name it checkout.js because it will be the checkout form. And we'll also need a checkout.module.css file for the styling, though I'll provide the styling to you once we're done setting up that form. So here in the checkout component, we now want to create a new functional component. So we create our component as we always did. We can import React, depends on your project setup if you need that or not. I don't need it here, so I'll omit it. And I will already import classes from /checkout.module.css. Now in here, we want to return a form. We want to return a form with the various inputs for the different values we want to fetch. For this, I'll wrap every input into a div with a class name of classes.control. And in there, we can have a label, let's say for the name of the user. So that will be for an input with an ID of name. And then we have that input thereafter of type text with an ID of name. Should be matching that value here for accessibility. And we also add another input where we fetch the address of the user. So we want to have the street, and that should also be of type text. However, I'll give it an ID of street. And I add a new input where I also want to get the postal code. So that will get an ID of postal and will also still be of type text. Technically, the postal code looks like a number, but it should be text so that we can also start with 0 without kind of treating this as a null value, which I don't want. So that will also be text. And then last but not least, let's also grab the city, which is also text. So a bunch of text data which we're fetching here. The name, the street, the postal code, and the city. And then we also need a button to confirm this. So I'll say confirm on that button. Now that we built this basic unstyled checkout component, we can go back to the cart, and here I will then import checkout from ./checkout, so that new checkout component, and render that here below the total amount. And for the moment, I will always render it. We'll later make sure that it only shows up once we click on order. If I now save this, we have that form here with the confirm button. Now, of course, there are a couple of styling issues which we'll fix in a second, but before we fix those issues, let's make sure that this form only shows up when we click order, and that when it shows up, we actually get rid of these two buttons down there, and instead we only show the confirm button, and maybe also a cancel button here. And that we then also have basic functions that get triggered when we click those buttons. So let's make sure that this form only shows up once we did click on order. Now for this in the cart component, we have this order button, and currently it's not doing anything. So of course here we can add an on-click listener, the on-click prop, to trigger some function when that is clicked. So here I'll add a new function, order handler. And whenever this is clicked, I want to make sure that we show the checkout form. So we wire up the order button to the order handler function we just added. And then to show this checkout component conditionally, we need to use state. So let's import use state from React and then set up some state for this cart component. And here we could name the state is checking out or something like this. This sounds a bit weird. Let's maybe name it is checkout like this, and set is checkout. And initially that's false because initially we're not in checkout mode. But I want to set it to true if we clicked on the order handler. So here I'll set is checkout to true then. And now we can use the is checkout state to conditionally render the checkout component. So we can check if is checkout is truthy and use this syntax, which you saw a lot in the course, to render checkout if is checkout is truthy. And with that, if we save this, initially there's nothing here, but if I click on order, we show that. Now we might be running into some space issues here if that gets longer and longer, but we'll work on the styling in a second. Before we work on the styling, let's hide these two buttons when we clicked on order, and let's also add a second button to the form therefore, which still allows us to cancel. Now to hide these two buttons, we of course just again need to render them conditionally, and I could therefore just add code where I check if is not checkout, and only if that's the case we render that div. But to keep the JSX code down there a bit more structured, I'll grab that div with those buttons and add a new constant here with my modal actions and store my div in there in the modal actions. And then it's the modal actions which I want to render conditionally if not is checkout, so that the JSX down there stays lean and we have that div with the actions up there. Okay, so now with that, these buttons are gone. Now let's add a new button to that form. So for this, in the checkout component, I'll add a second button where I say cancel, and important, this button will be of type button so that it doesn't submit the form. Only this button will submit the form. And speaking of that, I want to handle both button clicks. If we click the cancel button, I want to close the modal, and that therefore means that I in the end want to do the same thing as I did in the cart component when this close button was clicked. There we triggered props on close, so in the end I want to trigger that same function now from inside the checkout component. Hence, for the cancel button on click, I expect to get some function through props, which I can forward this event to, and I will simply expect the on cancel prop here. It's our component, so we can expect whichever prop we want. And I will expect the on cancel prop, which means that now when we use checkout in the cart component, we need to set a on cancel prop. And as a value, I want to point at the on close prop value to forward that event even further. And now, of course, we have some props drilling here. So we're passing props through multiple levels of components. And hence we could consider using context instead for managing the modal visibility. But I will stick to passing down props here because I don't want to make that too complex here and kind of go into a totally different area and add another context. So I will simply pass down my props here. Now with that, if I save this, if I click cancel, this modal is again closed. Okay, so that works. Now when we click confirm, the form will be submitted. And here we then want to validate the user input and show errors, show some feedback if something is invalid. And of course, if it is valid, we want to submit it to the backend, to Firebase. So for the moment, therefore, I want to focus on doing something, on triggering some function. And hence in checkout.js, we can add a new function here, confirm handler, where we get an event object. And we will get that automatically because I bind this function to the onSubmit event on the form. And then you learned that we should call event prevent default to ensure that the browser default, which would be to send an HTTP request, is prevented so that this request is not sent. And with that, this button will trigger this form submission and will therefore trigger this function. Now we need to validate the user input, and for that we need to read what the user entered. And we then want to show some feedback and, of course, potentially, if everything is all right, send the card data to the backend. But step by step, in the next lecture, we'll work on validating this and on showing some feedback.